Hello, and welcome to this last panel session of the day. You may well be flagging, but this should be a fascinating and important conversation. My name is Chris Hall. I'm the founding editor of ESG Investor, a sister publication of Regulation Asia, which is focused on the sustainable investment challenges facing institutional investors. I will be your moderator. For the next 45 minutes, we will explore the theme of environmental crime and illegal wildlife trading. Our aim is to help banks, compliance officers in particular, to better understand the activities, the regulatory responses, and the role of banks in prevention. To do this, Regulation Asia has brought together a highly qualified panel with deep expertise across key areas, including policy and regulation, law enforcement, financial crime compliance, diplomacy, and on the ground practical prevention. We'll split the session into three parts. First, outlining the landscape. Second, digging deeper into some of the practicalities of tackling environmental crime and illegal wildlife trading. And finally, we will try to leave you with some key takeaways. We hope these will help you to ensure current and future compliance, but also to proactively support the prevention of these dangerous and destabilizing activities. Please, while we're talking, send in your questions. We will answer as many of them as we can at the end, if we have time. Environmental crime and illegal wildlife trafficking is a serious problem with far-reaching implications, and it's only likely to get bigger. This means it will play a bigger role in banks' financial crime compliance activities in future. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, human demand for wildlife products already generates $23 billion annually every year, and threatens at least 1 million plant and animal species. Even more worrying than that is that it presents an existential threat to humanity, because the destruction and degradation of habitats that go alongside these crimes increases our exposure to zoonotic diseases. We also need to understand these activities in the context of other criminality. According to a recent report from the Financial Action Task Force, environmental crime, including forestry crime, illegal mining, and waste trafficking, is extremely profitable criminal enterprise, and it generates billions in criminal gains each year. It fuels corruption, and it converges with many other serious and organized crimes, such as tax fraud, drug trafficking, and forced labor. Light sanctions and limited efforts make this a low risk and high reward source of income for many criminals. As such, the task force has stressed the need for AML authorities to collaborate with environmental crime investigators, environmental agencies, and other non-traditional partners and foreign counterparts. In this opening section of the discussion, I will ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and to comment on an area of the subject on which they have particularly deep experience and expertise, starting with Alex Reid, who is a research fellow for Organised Crime and Policing Team at the Royal United Services Institute, which is a UK-based think tank.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Sorry, what are the core categories of environmental crime that we ought to be considering today, and what are the tools and rules being used by governments individually and collectively to prevent it?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. Good evening, everyone. As Chris has kind of briefly introduced, my name is Alexandria Reid, but you can call me Alex. And I am a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, as we are better known. And we are an independent think tank. Please don't be fooled by the word royal. It sounds a little bit misleading, but we have nothing really to do with the UK government, although we are based in the UK. I myself sit in the Organised Crime and Policing team, where I specialise in organised environmental crime and illicit financial flows. And so the way that I took the question that Chris kind of broadly asked me to think about was, how has the policy environment changed around environmental crime and financial crime? And have expectations changed when we're talking about environmental crime or not? And my answer to that is that it is significantly different to when we were talking about this topic, 3-4 years ago. We now have a huge amount of attention on this issue amongst an audience like yourselves for the first time. And in some respects, illegal wildlife trade is one of those areas that's really kind of now at the forefront of people's thinking about kind of non-traditional security threats and the types of compliance activities that they need to be thinking about for the future as well. And it's an area where previously the FATF-style regional bodies have really been ahead of the game. So we had ESAMLAG's report for East and Southern Africa in 2016. We had the Asia-Pacific group's report in 2017. And then finally, we had the FATF's own global evaluation in 2020. And what all of those studies showed was that there is almost no financial action being taken when it comes to organised environmental crime, whether you're talking about illegal wildlife trade or more recently in the FATF's report that considered illegal mining, waste trafficking and illicit timber trade. And really what they said collectively was that suspicious activity reports are not being filed, financial investigations are not taking place, and enforcement activity remains very disproportionately focused on low-level criminals who have barely, any impact from a disruptive perspective. I think that's a real human rights kind of issue element to this as well. And so this panel is very timely insofar as it's bringing together the right audiences to discuss to what extent the recommendations that were made in the FATF's report in particular last year in June 2020 are being taken forward or not. And we know that they will be conducting a review of the extent to which the private sector and the public sector have taken their recommendations and carried them forward, that will be discussed at the October plenary later this year. And broadly speaking, they really asked countries to do three things. The first thing that they asked them to do was to identify and assess money laundering risks related to IWT in their jurisdiction. The second thing was to ensure that national laws, that legislation were permissive for allowing financial investigations and for allowing money laundering charges to be brought in environmental crime cases. And the third thing was to pursue greater financial investigations in those cases. And so in some ways, when it comes to expectations, yes, the expectations are changing, but the question is, what can we expect when they do their review later this year? Can we realistically expect countries in that 12-month timeline to have made a big change? Can we expect financial institutions to have made a big change in that timeline? So I'm very eager to hear from colleagues on the line today about how they've acted on those recommendations and what some of the challenges and hopefully unexpected opportunities have been of doing so. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you, Alex. We'll now move on to Sharon. And obviously, Alex paints a picture where really not enough is being done at the policy level and possibly not at the financial institution level either. Sharon Pamplona is head of financial crime at ANZ Bank in Hong Kong. Sharon, how would you say, how would you also partly kind of respond to kind of Alex's points, but how would you also explain how criminals are using the banking system to facilitate their crimes at the moment, and in the kind of environmental and wildlife space, and what are banks doing at the moment to support those government measures, limited as they are?
Yes. Hi, Chris, and I'm very happy to be here. So just a quick introduction, since you've already mentioned that currently I'm the head of financial crime here in ANZ Hong Kong. I've also been assigned to several Asian ANZ jurisdictions, primarily working with a financial crime team. So I'll jump right into your question with regard to how the criminals are using the financial institution. So, I think it's a given that the financial ecosystem is being used by these criminals. And the most common that we have seen so far would be using of fraudulent trade documentation, as well, of course, as bribery and corruption. And by experience, the most difficult would be the commingling of both legitimate and illicit activity. So for ANZ, since we are one of the signatories on the United for Wildlife Mansion House Declaration back in 2018, so a lot of things have been done. We made several commitments, but I'd just like to focus on so far what we have been doing. So, it can be considered as a best practices. So number one would be the sharing of insights and data. And I can probably talk a little bit more about that with regard to the co-authoring that we have done with OSTRAC and Fintel Alliance. Also refining and integrating developing typologies. So similar to the cases that we've handled before, for instance, when we were also tackling modern slavery and human trafficking, as well as the child pornography in the Philippines. We had a similar approach. So from the intel that we have received, we've also been doing media monitoring. So if we see anything in the news that might be connected to illegal wildlife trafficking, we do a proactive search in our database whether these customers are in our portfolio. And also, of course, embedding illegal wildlife trafficking screening in our AML system, as well as in the payment platforms, such as adding for payment details, what would trigger an alert if it's related to illegal wildlife trafficking. And the other thing, and I think we've already heard this several times, during this webinar, that we cannot stress enough the importance of strong public and private sector partnership. For ANZ, we work with Australian Federal Police and Border Control, as well as the Fintel Alliance. So we provided insights, knowledge, expertise, and this has actually resulted on some wins. We co-authored the guidelines that OSTRAC provided, and this is something that we will continue to do. And probably the other thing is, I think everyone will agree that this is a transnational crime. It cannot be worked in silos. So with the awareness campaign that ANZ has been doing, both internal and external, we are encouraged to get in touch with our local NGOs. So, it would be easy for us to pick up a phone, call an SME if we have some questions on how we handle certain situation in the bank. In fact, the reason why I am here right now, and it's not because I'm an expert of illegal wildlife trafficking, it's because when the awareness campaign was done by ANZ, I felt that this is something that I want to be a part in. So definitely raising awareness within the bank is the first step, and then leverage also on the tools that you have.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm sure it won't be the last time we mention public and private partnership in this context. I'm now going to turn to Steve Galster, who is the founder and chair of Freeland, which is a frontline organisation working for a world free of wildlife trafficking and human slavery. Steve works at a number of different levels, both at the kind of policy, interacting with legislators and policy makers, but also working very much on the ground as well. So, Steve, I'd be grateful if you could kind of comment perhaps on what some of your experiences and what that tells you about the current state of kind of prevention. I understand that you're going to use the share slide facility to illustrate your comments. I'm not sure, you may be on mute, Steve.
Okay. Could you see my slide there?
Yes, we could, and we can now hear you, so that's great.
Great. Okay, now I've got to go back to the slide. Just 1 second here. All right. Pardon me 1 second here. Okay. All right, so you can see this okay. I was asked to respond to a couple points and questions, and I thought the most efficient way to do this would be to just tell a very quick story within 4 to 5 minutes on a wildlife trafficking case in regard to anti-money laundering and to bear in mind that I think most of our audience here are compliance officers. This is a case that was executed in several stages, most recently in March of this year. And there's a syndicate that what we've dubbed the name Hydra, transnational, mainly across Asia, partly into Africa as well, with connections to other parts of the world, including Australia, Europe, and the United States. And to date, the anti-money laundering authorities have identified and frozen and seized some of the $46.5 million of assets linked to this syndicate's mysterious wealth, basically coming from not just suspected, but in many cases proven illegal trade in rhino horn, other things, pangolin trafficking, big cat trafficking. And so, some of the red flag indicators from the research, we've worked on this case together with the Thai anti-money laundering organization, as well as FIUs and a few other countries that they worked with. And the origin of funds was typically coming from the countries you see on the screen. And the destination of the funds were, in most of the cases, the financial transfers were done with regular bank transfers. Banks didn't ask any questions, probably didn't know. And but these are some of the countries in Africa that the money was going to. And we found that one of the common denominators of the infractions was a lot of the trade was actually going through captive breeding facilities, zoos, and just legal trade. This is a really important point, is that a lot of the illegal trade is masked by the legal trade. And for that matter, in regard to COVID-19, we have to remember that a lot of the viruses that have been transferred, a lot of zoonotic risks are not just from illegally traded animals, but legally traded animals as well. The virus doesn't discriminate. More specifically, we found business links largely between Vietnam, China, and those countries in Africa I showed before. And again, the bulk of the trade is not being done, by trucks and boats smuggling in the darkness of night. It's done in broad daylight through legally registered cargo, through legally registered companies, which opens up great opportunities for investigators because there is all kinds of trade-based money laundering going on, fraud, tax evasion, etc. So in this case, I think a big success factor was getting technology and training into the hands of the law enforcement chain to accumulate and quickly analyze data from computers and phones. So we worked with a company called Celebrite, which provided these, really sped things up, and then migrating that information to teams of data analysts, including at the Thai anti-money laundering organization, which had the unique ability, the authority to also check bank records. Those two factors combined led to some of the first seizures of around $36 million worth of assets. And also the intelligence led to identifying one of the major characters, nearly a kingpin, in the syndicate, which led to his arrest. Also, after that, though, it led to his acquittal, in spite of the fact that and that was a criminal case, in spite of the fact that many of the agencies had buckets of data, but they just weren't brought together under the Attorney General to knit all that data together to make a lock-solid case. So that was an opportunity lost. However, the case was picked up again by the anti-money laundering organization. Being a civil society organization and this being civil law, we were able to work very openly, hand in glove, to put information together. And they got back on the trail and they seized $11.5 million more in assets that were linked to that suspected kingpin and many other people. So I think what was key in all this is that, we're an NGO, so we get funds to do training, et cetera. But what we found was really useful here was to do joint training, convening banks, investigation and compliance officers with some of the FIUs, with ourselves, to make sure they had this information. They knew about the indicators. That was very helpful. And so we have actually a training program for that. We call it Trafficking Free Enterprises. We also work on human trafficking. So we do it for both human and wildlife trafficking. And the last thing I'll say is the next steps that we're working on are about compliance. We are working now, we have an MOU at the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly. We brief them regularly with reports and webinars. Our most recent one was on the link between COVID-19 and illegal wildlife trade and the need for One Health policies. But we have also been working with them. We've provided multi-language reports making the case for conservation restitution funds. That 46.5 million, for example, once it's liquidated, it's probably more like 35 million that the state would get. The AML agencies might get up to 40% of that. The rest of it goes to the Treasury. We'd like to see a portion of that go back into the enforcement agencies that did a good job, besides the AML folks, and also shared into a fund that could be used for nature recovery. So this is something we're actively working on, as well as making compliance with counter wildlife trafficking a regulation for financial institutions. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Steve. Your presentation obviously kind of leads very nicely into kind of the final set of opening comments from Chinali Patel, who has a extensive background in kind of law enforcement, but is now Consul and policy lead for international illicit finance at the British Consulate-General in Hong Kong. Chinali is very focused on the kind of diplomatic and collaborative efforts across the region. So, Chinali, what kind of activities and initiatives are you involved with and are seeing that are kind of really bearing fruit in terms of positive and meaningful action?
Thank you, Chris. And just to say a huge good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's made an effort to be part of the Regulation Asia Conference. It's great to be part of this, actually, and great to be kind of, be part of this panel. As Alex outlined, we are bringing such diverse perspectives and kind of, shared learning to the panel session today. I think something I want to kind of start off with before I go into some of the details of the initiatives that we've worked on. Public-private partnerships, like with any serious and organized crime that you would look at, sits at the heart of everything that you would do through any sector lens. I think everything that Alex, Sharon, and Stephen outlined reflected to you that actually how crucial it is to think about that as a kind of a beginning step. So why is it so important? COVID challenges, the last 4 years, as Alex outlined, has truly highlighted the rising global threat of illegal wildlife trade and the associated money flows, but also how this is kind of, expanding into broader environmental crime. We alone cannot address or tackle a threat. What it really requires is a whole system response and approach. In doing so, we need to think about who can we bring on board in terms of shared learning, in terms of raising awareness, in terms of even sharing basic typologies, in terms of even kind of working with different partners and different jurisdictions. In doing that in Hong Kong, I was very cognizant that there are resourcing issues for banks, for different sectors. There are multiple priorities, no matter what organization you work with. So the mindset that we worked with and the approach that we took is each sector is involved actually in the supply chain where illegal wildlife trade is concerned. It impacts them in some way or the other. So the starting point was highlighting why does it matter to shipping sector, transport sector? Why does it matter to banks to come on board to address it? In doing so, and in working with partnership with WWF, ADM Capital, United for Wildlife Foundation, ACAMS, and a range of other partners, we produce what you see on screen there. It's actually adopting a really effective UK model. And to put it simplistically, What it does is what Alex, Stephen, and Sharon highlighted. It takes you through a journey of how you need to address it through different sectors. So, for example, for Pursue, it is really important to bring together financial crime intelligence roundtables. Let's share trends, let's share typologies. We did exactly that with Standard Chartered and other key partners around kind of, that kind of a discussion. And it was effective because you could see where the trends were, you could see the emerging risks, and we were following legal parameters in doing so. The other thing I wanted to highlight around the Pursue, which is really ramping up the intelligence and following the money aspect that Alex highlighted, which is a key FATF recommendation, is ensuring legislative aspects are embedded so it allows meaningful financial investigations to take place. And in doing that, I'm so pleased to say, with the amazing efforts by the civil society in Hong Kong, ADM Capital, WWF, and a range of partners, and the Honorable Elizabeth Court in Hong Kong, we are nearing the stages when we hope that the Organised Serious Crime Ordinance in Hong Kong will be allowed, to pass through the Legislative Council, and we can then pursue the financial investigations aspect. Prevention is equally key. And a practical example of prevention is Shipping Sector Compendium Toolkit that's been produced and is going to be launched globally soon. So it's really understanding the needs of different sectors. So in this regard, what are the red flags? What are the risk indicators? What are the really good case studies that the shipping sector and the port operators could refer to? And in doing so, can I just highlight, a lot of partners came together willingly to ensure that we can amplify the impact of this. But nothing of the first two can be done, as Sharon particularly highlighted, if we don't raise awareness. So in raising awareness and making sure the communities are more resilient, we have worked in Hong Kong with a range of partners. Food Panda, we've worked with, educational material been embedded into schools through WWF, but we've also, through ACAMS and WWF, launched a course, particularly highlighting what the financial sector can do to kind of identify suspicious financial transactions. So in summary, it is crucial that we think of who we can partner with when we think tackling not just IWT, illegal wildlife trade, and associated money flows, but any threat type.
Thank you, Chinali. To a certain extent, it feels as if we're somewhat kind of playing catch up with the criminals from this perspective of collaboration. As I think Steve highlighted, they're already collaborating and working with multiple partners in a complex supply chain already. In this kind of second section of the discussion, we'll try to dig deeper into some of the kind of practical issues facing the kind of coalition of forces involved in preventing these crimes. And perhaps, Sharon, I can start off with you talking about the question of the kind of connections between environmental crimes and other sorts of criminal activity. Steve in particular mentioned that there's kind of links with legal entities. So perhaps I could ask you to kind of kick off a conversation about how do criminals kind of hide their activities, and what can be done by banks and their partners to better trace those activities and those financial flows?
Yep. Thanks, Chris. So just like any other traditional and legal commerce, illegal wildlife trafficking is a business of crime. So it has demand and supply, logistical supply chains, foreign exchange, and informal money movement. Going back to my point earlier on the commingling of legal and illegal funds, for instance, in Australia, wherein illegal breeders and suppliers may not be aware that the wildlife or the reptiles that are being purchased from them would be for international export. So definitely there's a lot of challenges there. And Chinali actually pointed out, she mentioned about the resourcing issues, and that's a reality. Whenever new emerging financial crime or new typologies, it doesn't always mean that a new team would be set up to tackle this specific financial crime. So definitely we need to be able to leverage on the tools that we have available, like for the TBML typologies, as well as screening that we have used in the past. So that's definitely something that we could look into and potentially see if there are any linkages on illegal wildlife trafficking movements or transactional movements. And also one other thing with regard to with the sources that we have right now, in fact, the ACAMS course, which is ending illegal wildlife trade, that is a requirement for all financial crime heads and other financial crime roles here in ANZ. So I think that's something that ANZ has been very good in promoting. It means that if we have constraint on certain resources, there are definitely other ways that we can address this. And so that's pretty much those are the things that we are doing, because if we learn new trends or typologies, like from the other institutions, from the different reports that we are getting, that's definitely something that we can replicate. And likewise, we also do share our insights with both public and private sectors, so other financial institutions can also benefit from that.
Thank you, Sharon. Before we move on to the next topic, is there anyone else who wants to kind of comment in particular on the kind of question of the kind of web of kind of participants relating to criminal activity of environmental crime and trafficking, and how it's the kind of tactics to kind of trace those linkages and kind of interrupt them? Alex.
Yeah, I'm very happy to jump in here. So the word that my panelist said that kind of interested me most here was commingling of proceeds and of products. And I think possibly for the first time, we're really starting to think about ESG and financial crime as being two sides of the same coin. So we're not just thinking about environmental harm as something that would be nice to avoid, but we're thinking about the actual penalties of facilitating environmental harm from environmental crime and kind of environmental abuse more broadly. And that feeds into much bigger policy debates around the need for supply chain integrity, around enhanced human rights due diligence, things that you'll be very familiar with, Chris. And it also speaks to a big movement around requiring ultimate beneficial ownership records to be kept by countries. So what kinds of data does that provide to us that we need to be able to understand environmental crime across the supply chain, to investigate environmental crime across the supply chain? And that's been a very big part of G7 and G20 activity this year, and that will definitely put pressure on other policy forums and the FATF process that's ongoing around understanding where we're going to take ultimate beneficial ownership record keeping in the future. It's great to see environment being at the heart of that now.
Thank you, Alex. And certainly, of course, you're absolutely right that there are a number of kind of drivers that are encouraging kind of greater kind of disclosure and kind of transparency along kind of supply chains. But I wonder if I could turn to Steve, who I know is particularly kind of focused on the kind of current state of data sharing and use of technology, digital intelligence, in order to kind of better track and disrupt criminal activity, and also to kind of share information between kind of stakeholders on the prevention side. Steve, what's your kind of current take on how well technology is being used and how well data is being shared, and what we can do to improve?
Well, the technology's there, the data's there. There's very little sharing of the intelligence and the analysis between countries. There's a little bit more being shared now between agencies. Just historically, it's been only very recently that some financial intelligence units let's not forget about tax inspectors too. They're very important. Have actually been brought into the so-called CWT community, counter wildlife trafficking. I showed the example of the Thai anti-money laundering office. We went to them way back in 2010. We just couldn't get any traction on criminal cases. And then they had to wait for this to become a predicate offense. And then ever since then, they've been into this. And I think the Thai MLRO has been a model there. The South African SARS, FIU over in South Africa has been always very active, a few other countries. But for the most part in Asia, most FIUs haven't really been involved in this. So I think, the data's there, the intelligence is there. We've got link analysis programs, IBM and Celebrite and all these companies that want to offer it, but we need to see some incentives. That's why I brought up the fact that we're dealing with MPs to do two things. One, to make CWT a compliance measure for not just banks, but corporations in general. And then secondly, to allow for the reprogramming of asset seizures and forfeitures to go back to the enforcement agencies and to conservation restitution funds. We need that carrot. I think the compliance measures are coming down the pike. It'll be like human trafficking. I don't know when, but banks should probably assume that because it is coming. And secondly, the restitution funds, hopefully there's a couple countries in the region like Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam that are showing interest in that. And I think that would really propel more activity among the FIUs with the banks. And we see a lot more positive action like we saw recently.
Thank you, Steve. Chinali, perhaps you'd be interested in commenting on Steve's point about the kind of lack of information sharing between FIUs, and whether you feel that the kind of diplomatic and kind of cross-jurisdictional efforts that you're involved with will kind of drive change in that respect.
Yeah, thank you. And I think kind of agreed with Stephen's points that he helpfully made. I think looking at it and speaking quite, I guess, realistically is two points really. The first is, I think it's got to be a willingness. There's got to be a political will in terms of considering illegal wildlife trade and environmental crime as a broader priority. So whether you're a financial intelligence unit, whether you are, say we have a UK GIMLET or a Hong Kong FIMLET, you've got to consider this as one of your top priority threats. What that does, if it is part of that model, is that it allows through, again, that public-private partnership to do the information sharing, to talk about cases, to talk about SDRs, to be honest. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that Alex was also referring to that came out of the FATF report. And I think also the second point related to that is, how do you utilize the national risk assessment? So embedding it within that is a really good starting point, because what that again allows to do is getting that law enforcement attention, resources attention to it, which allows an effective actually information sharing between law enforcement and broader sectors, including crucially banks and civil society. So it isn't, I guess, addressed fully yet, to be honest, Chris. I think there's way to go. But I would also mention Alex's point around G7, G20, and what FATF is looking to do in terms of 12 months on review. And I do think these are crucial platforms and forums and hooks to perhaps gather momentum.
Thank you, Chinali. I wanted to turn now quickly to the kind of question of different levels of different kind of perspectives across jurisdictions from the point of view of we've already kind of touched on the fact that supply chains can be complex and involve a lot of different participants, and it can involve a lot of kind of jurisdictions where whether you call it kind of corruption or turning a blind eye, where there are kind of countries where that are kind of serving as hubs across the kind of supply chain, and it's very kind of can be quite difficult to kind of have effective action. And I'd like to turn to Alex again to kind of for your perspective on what are the most effective measures. And we know that the kind of OECD has looked into kind of training programs. We've already mentioned extraterritorial kind of regulations, such as the kind of EC's plans for greater due diligence on across supply chains on human rights and environmental abuses. What really kind of is going to kind of move the needle, so to speak, Alex?
I think this is such an important question. There are so many different technical reasons, legitimate technical reasons, why financial investigations are not undertaken in illegal wildlife trade cases. But also we have to think about probably the most powerful disincentive for pursuing those investigations, which is corruption. It comes potentially with professional risk to follow the money associated with these cases, because we know that corrupt actors are involved at almost every single stage of the chain. And it comes potentially, with risks to your safety as well. So how can we provide the right mechanisms that actually allows, different agencies such as the AMLO in Thailand to pursue those investigations around the world? And this is something that we're kind of deeply concerned with and thinking about very actively. And one of the things that Chinali mentioned there around having the gimlet, around having a kind of interagency mechanism to monitor specific cases that kind of meet the threshold for where you would expect a financial investigation to be conducted, for example, can be a very powerful thing. So instead of having, a single institution, a single point of failure, you can introduce more civil society monitoring around those cases. You can bring different agencies together to ensure that there is a kind of collective responsibility to follow those cases as well. But I think the most important part of that debate is what are the incentives and disincentives, as Stephen has said, for following the money in these cases.
Thanks, Alex. Astonishingly, and perhaps kind of slightly disappointingly, we're already kind of running out of time, and I think it's that's a kind of behoves us to kind of essentially kind of try to sum up our kind of key kind of takeaways that we'd like to leave with the kind of compliance community who have been kind of listening today. And perhaps maybe Sharon, we should start with you in terms of as many of our kind of audience are indeed your peers. How would you kind of sum up what they need to be kind of thinking about as they kind of look forward to their kind of priorities and incorporating environmental crime issues into their kind of financial crime compliance efforts going forward?
Yes, definitely. I think the key takeaway would be, the more we do, the better we will become in disrupting illegal wildlife trafficking. In fact, over the years, there has been a lot of developments. There are tools, information that are readily available. But the sad reality is, as we get better in detecting and disrupting them, these criminals also tend to up their game. But I think there are definitely some wins, starting with a FATF report on illegal wildlife trafficking, and then also OSTRAC releasing the guide, and not going far here in Hong Kong. It has been recognized, wildlife crime has been already recognized as a serious organized crime. Considering that with the geographical location of Hong Kong being a transit place as well as this destination for wildlife trafficking, I think definitely we're moving in the right direction. So what at the top of my head, what I'm thinking is, for the financial institutions, in order for us to be able to do our part, in terms of filing our suspicious transaction report, we need to be able to provide quality information, quality data. It's not just we don't really want this stigma with the banks that the only responsibility that we have is to file an STR and we leave it up to the law enforcement. We need to do better at that, and an only way for us to do that is to be proactive. We don't just wait for these regulators to instruct us what to do. There are definitely different ways, and again, partnering with your local organizations, and then just keep yourself updated, because new trends will come out every day, and you need to be ahead of the game. If not ahead of the game, at least we have that awareness, and from there we would know what would be the next steps. And lastly, if it can be overwhelming, just like any other emerging financial crime, but I think being here in this webinar, I think that's a first step. We can connect with so many different people that can help us in our day-to-day activities.
Thank you, Sharon. Chinali, I wonder if I could quickly turn to you for a final comment, perhaps speaking to the audience on perhaps what they might expect from the kind of the diplomatic intergovernmental round later in the year.
So I think that as a global policy platform, there are two big events happening. So we know there's a G7, platform, and the communique around the G7 finance ministers, particularly as Alex was highlighting the beneficial ownership. So, the dial is shifting even at a ministerial level in some of the, high kind of really crucial jurisdictions. We've seen that effort and progress in China. We've seen that effort and progress in different parts of Asia. Australia recently has really kind of, done work around this, but there is more to be done. So from a kind of a working level perspective, which is where the real effort, it's got to move up. I would say, think about partnerships, think about civil society, chambers of commerce. To me, civil society has been so imperative because the data, the intelligence, the information really sits there, and they're crucial to this. And think about cross-sector partnerships as well. Shipping sector is an example of that. And my final point was going to be around, please continue to share information, to continue to be on this kind of, forums and panels, because the criminal networks evolve all the time. This threat is moving. And as Alex would say to me, illegal fisheries, is another kind of a high-risk area with corporate structures. And there's kind of, the other broader as the corruption as enabler sectors as well. So this is not over yet, but thank you for making time today.
Thank you, Chinali. Alex, I know that you have been involved with training organizations in the kind of finance sector. What would be your last message to them today?
My last message to them today would be that I really hope that the policy process helps to produce national risk assessments that are genuinely drawing on data that is relevant to the jurisdictions that they are operating in, that understands that there are lots of different products that are in the illegal wildlife trade. It's not just pangolins, it's not just elephants, it's about thinking about supply chains that exist in the jurisdictions that you are operating in. And then it produces a document that they can draw on that tells them that this is something that the supervisor, their regulator, is focused on, and that they do expect them to report against. So I think that financial institutions are owed that. They are being asked to pay more attention to this crime type, and they absolutely should, but they should also be confident that there will be follow-up from law enforcement, and that reporting will lead to proactive investigative activity as well.
Thank you, Alex. And Steve, finally, I know that you think that you're sure that there will be kind of regulatory implications that will flow from the link from kind of exploitation of illegal exploitation of nature, the increased prevalence of zoonotic disease, and in particular kind of COVID-19. But what would your final thoughts be to messages to our compliance audience?
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Well, first of all, I would say I know that in the banking community, because we've worked with enough banks, that there's people working, compliance officers and other banking officers who really care about this issue. So that's good. We know that we're not just in the audience because of the compliance measures, although that's important too. But my two takeaway messages would be, first, illegal trade hides in the legal trade. And that's really important because I've learned, I've done investigations on this for 32 years, and at least for the last 10 years, 100% of our investigations start by mapping out who are the legal traders, the businesses, the persons, and frankly, who are the government focal points issuing the legal trade certificates. Not that all the legal traders and the government officers that do that are corrupt, but there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it, and that's where a lot of the illegal trade rests. And so, you know, when you're providing a bank account or financial services for folks that are doing legal trade or working in those parts of government, I think they should be vetted very carefully, because the second point is, like you said, compliance is coming down the pike. I don't know what's going to come quicker, the compelling banks to comply with counter wildlife trafficking, or these restitution funds I talked about, which will incentivize agencies to do more work on this. Either way, somebody's going to come knocking at the doors of the banks, hopefully soon, to say, you know, we'd like to see who you've got there, if you're up to snuff on vetting and making sure you're not providing financial services to wildlife traffickers. One of those things is going to happen before the other. I don't know which one, but we're working on both. And then, you know, once that does happen, I think banks, before that happens, banks should be taking advantage of the rich data and analysis that already exists on this trade. Like Chinali said, there's a bunch of intel already, mainly in civil society, but increasingly among some government agencies that have taken up. We've all got, you know, there's training programs, there's reports. What else do we have? Yeah, there's plenty of intel, and we're all looking for champions in the banking industry. So that would be my last remark. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks to all of our panelists. I can only apologise for we have run over time slightly, but as a reporter, I know that when you have 4 such excellent and well-informed sources, you don't get in the way. You let them comment, and I hope that everyone will understand the fact that we have gone slightly over time. But we have done so in a very good and important cause. Thanks again to all our panelists. Thanks very much to all our audience as well. All that remains for me to do is, as one co-founder of ESG Investor, is to hand over to another, Nick Wakefield.